All right, here's the first lesson of Unit 9 on the road to World War II, 1930s foreign policy. We need to describe the origins of U.S. foreign policy during the 1930s, what's driving it, the characteristics, response to things going on in the outside world, and its economic and political activities that are driving things. There's your left side snap chart for this one. All those important things are going to be covered right here. Reminder, factors allowing fascism in Europe in the 1920s, radical totalitarian regimes coming back after World War I. Democracy doesn't take hold. The cost of World War I. Great Depression problems at home for all these countries. Remember, it's a worldwide depression, and a real strong reluctance to start another war and to avoid future wars is really at the back of everyone's mind in Europe and in the United States. And there's really a belief in the United States that we can't isolate ourselves. We have these great ocean, two great oceans that are able to maintain our isolationism, and that things across the big water aren't really going to affect us, and we're going to establish some legislation to make sure that happens. There's a policy of appeasement that you're probably familiar with your world history class. Make sure you know this. The appeasement, giving into the radical demands of Hitler, Mussolini, for example, lead us toward more radical demands and eventually war. The League of Nations is weak. It has virtually no power, isn't able to do anything to stop the radical actions of Japan and these other countries in Europe, Italy and Germany. And there's really a strong fear of communism spreading as well. In fact, that strong fear is probably the strongest thing that is out there at that time. It's important to remember that in the 1920s, remember, we have the Kellogg-Briand Pact, we have the Washington Naval Conference in the 1920s, efforts to reduce the buildup of naval arms and an arms race. It really has an effect until we get into, notice this dead area here, the growth of naval military arms in the late 1920s. There's not much going on, but when we hit 1930, the Great Depression begins. Militarism and the rise of militarism in all these countries starts to come back again. This is a way of rebuilding the economies, rebuilding these nations to basically right the wrongs that they felt had happened to them in the previous war and in previous historical events, and we're on our way back to another war, World War II. Right? The London Naval Treaty was the last one that was really attempted. In 1930, they declined to renew that in 1936. In 1931, Manchuria is attacked. It's a province north of China, and it's heavily enriched with raw materials and resources like oil, especially iron and metals and things of that nature that are important for an industrial nation to build a modern industrial army. This is a region that has been fought over between the Russians and the Chinese and the Japanese over eons of time. The United States and Hoover, with the Stimson Doctrine, basically says, we're going to stay out. The League of Nations condemns it. Japan leaves the League of Nations for being condemned for their actions, but the United States and the League of Nations says they won't recognize anything that comes out of this, and the territorial change here is not recognized, and so the League of Nations doesn't have Japan anymore. And so our isolationism is heavily driven in the United States. World War I is a huge irritation for us. We're angry about the Treaty of Versailles. There's a large war debt that hasn't been paid back. As you can see on the map, there's nations in Europe, especially the British and the French, that owe money to the United States. And during the Great Depression, there was a moratorium and a stop on that because they really couldn't pay. The whole idea of World War I and what it was about is going to be linked to a conspiracy, not only in Europe and Germany, but also in the United States. We'll get that a little bit later. There's a shift in our foreign policy with Latin American countries. We start to move military forces out of the Dominican Republic, Nicaragua, Haiti. This is from the time period and leftover forces from the administrations of Hoover and Taft, Taft, and Wilson especially. There's a strong concern here that in our Great Depression we need to build up a positive relationship with these countries to maybe improve economic activity and exchanges between them. We finally released Cuba from the Platt Amendment in 1934, which was said it was going to happen that way in the Jones Act of 1917. We did keep Guantanamo Bay, of course, yet still retained today, and we give a little bit of freedom to Panama over the Panama Canal, but not much, not completely until 1999. The Clark Memorandum in 1928 kind of signified this change in things, and it basically said the United States is never going to intervene in Latin American affairs except to protect U.S. property rights there, business rights there, and that's generally pretty consistent with what had happened with Teddy Roosevelt, Taft, and with Wilson and Hoover and other presidents previous. But it is also kind of a rebuke of the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, and that is that corollary stated the United States will use force to protect our interests there. Right. So it's kind of a catch-22, but there's a statement of being concerned about that. And this is linked to the good neighbor policy that's important to know here. All of this is an effort to continue improve relations with the Latin American, Central American countries. FDR really gets after this policy and really promotes it. It was started under Hoover, but it's also a reaction to the aggression of what's going on in the 1930s, the need for positive, improved trade, the importance of having a better relationship with nations that are also seemingly, maybe possibly leaning towards some fascist alliances with Italy and especially Germany. And the document that we'll read here, the Good Neighbor Policy, is going to do a good job of highlighting what that is all about, and that is pretty much the core of it there in green. So it's a policy of non-intervention and cooperation, and it's for concerns out of the radical rise of fascism, but it's also a concern out of trying to improve our relationship with other countries for economic gain and improvement. Walt Disney promoted the Good Neighbor Policy a little bit. There is a video clip from 1942 about a little character that was created in by Walt Disney called Joe Carioca. If you search that up, you can watch that little bit of a clip. This is, of course, in the midst of World War II, but there's all kinds of propaganda in media, and especially Walt Disney and Hollywood are used during the war years to try and promote those ideals and those policies. The United States recognizes the Soviet Union for the first time in 1933 when Lenin and his revolution established the communist system there in 1919. We didn't recognize them, didn't have any conversations or diplomatic relations with them, but we decided to do this for several reasons. One, we're concerned about the rise of power of Japan in the Pacific, and we don't want them to become too powerful to threaten our interests in the Pacific. And if you remember out here, there's this little place called the Philippines that gives us that open door into China and the rest of Asia. And this was also a concern back with Teddy Roosevelt, if you remember the Portsmouth Treaty, bringing a mediation to the Russo-Sino War, Japanese War, in the early 1900s to keep a balance of power there. This could also result in some trade opportunities. Other countries had already recognized them as well and had diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union as well. But this also came about with the agreement by Stalin to stop pushing this idea that we're bringing the revolution to the rest of the world. Lenin did a lot of that and pushed that. Stalin wasn't so much and was willing to back off of that for this to happen. So it was really kind of maybe good for the Soviet Union as well. And by having maybe a relationship with the Soviet Union, we can maybe balance out the power and check the power of the Japanese. The Philippines. The Tidings-McDuffie Act was passed in 1934, and it was the same year with the Platt Amendment going away for Cuba. The Jones Act also had talked about the Philippines becoming independent, and it basically says here with the Tidings-McDuffie Act that they would become independent in 10 years. That puts it at 1944. Actually, it'll happen in about 1945, the last year of World War II. The United States gets to keep some naval bases that are there. And some of the reasons behind this are that, one, U.S. labor kind of wants Filipino labor out of the U.S. economic system. They're seen as competition for U.S. labor. Competition also, sugarcane growers and plantation fruit growers from the Philippines compete with American fruit growers and sugar growers as well. Now, if the Philippines are not a part of the United States, they have to pay the tax, which means their produce is more expensive for Americans to buy, and they buy American. Remember that whole idea with the tariff. And the isolationists really believe that if we have control of this, we really have an increased risk of war if it's under our direct control and it's our colony. So no longer in 1933 are they going to be completely under our control. Excuse me, 1945 will be the final year, but in 1934, it states in 10 years that's going to go away. There's another set of agreements called the Reciprocal Trade Agreement. This term reciprocal might sound familiar with math, perhaps, for you a little bit, but if you think of another synonymous term, you might think of the term reciprocate. If someone says, hello, good morning to you, you might reciprocate by saying, hello, good morning back. Well, this basically is a policy that's promoted by Secretary of State Cordell Hull, and he believed that trade is a two-way street. You can only sell abroad as it is able to buy abroad. And the idea here is to get rid of the tariffs that have risen and increased in the late 1930s and the 1920s in the Republican administrations, and the biggest one was that Hawley-Smoot tariff that raised things to the highest levels in our history. And this is also part of the New Deal relief and recovery program to help get us out of the war. And so it amended the Hawley-Smoot tariff, and it basically gave the president executive power to lower rates up to 50%. And if the other country agrees to reduce their tariffs on American goods that we're trying to sell in their country, we'll do the same. We reciprocate. All right. So this is a way of trying to increase the money flow and get ourselves out of depression, and maybe even get a better relationship with foreign countries that perhaps are perhaps in some sort of connection with fascist elements and fascist regimes like the Nazis and the Italians, and to try and get a better relationship there to defend against those radical ideologies. There's a set of hearings that happened in 1934 called the Nye Committee Hearings, and this is a senator from the great state of North Dakota that says something was funny about World War I. It was needless. We must have gotten in for nefarious, funny reasons, perhaps immoral, greedy reasons, and there was an idea that it was about these merchants of death, bankers, big businesses, industry that helped establish some sort of connection to World War I for their own profit. And I always kind of joke that this is perhaps Bill Nye's grandpa or something to that effect. If you look at him, maybe there's a little bit of a resemblance, but it's a good way to kind of remember him. Probably not. Haven't really researched it, but Bill Nye's kind of a funny dude. And if you have a little bit of time, go ahead and check out the theme song to that, right? So their conclusions were the bankers, manufacturers, big business and industry, they wanted loans to the Allies to make money off of the war. Therefore, they had an interest in who won the war, and Mr. Wilson, President Wilson, Democratic President Wilson, revoked Germany by allowing Americans to sell goods to the warring nations, and resulted in American lives being lost on high seas, with ships being sunk to the bottom of the ocean. This draws the United States into the war. This conclusion is super important to this committee because it results in a series of Neutrality Acts in the 1930s that is going to put up rules and regulations to prevent this from ever happening again. So here they are. When the president proclaims the existence of a war, some rules automatically go into effect. One, we are prohibited as a country to sell arms to the belligerent, the fighting nations. Two, there's no loans to these fighting nations or credits of money in any way to the fighting nations. Again, this chart that we looked at in World War I shows that we did start significantly aiding Britain and France and not Germany, and we're tied, we are involved, we are not neutral in the war, it drew us in. Third, it forbade Americans to travel on vessels of nations at war. In contrast to 1915, for example, the Lusitania, the Sussex, the Arabic after that, being sunk, Americans die, it gets the American public opinion whipped up, Congress gets involved, it gets us closer to war. Fourth and fifth, non-military goods can be sold to these warring nations, but they have to be bought on a cash and carry basis. If you're going to buy something, wheat, food, clothes, that kind of thing, it's for cash, no credit, and you bring your ship, as you see in the Dr. Seuss video or cartoon here, you have to bring your ship. American ships will not go over there and bring it to you, risking American property and lives. And the fifth thing, no involvement in the Spanish Civil War that was started up in 1935-36, somewhere in there. So the Neutrality Acts are super important to know. This was going to keep us from war. It's limiting the options of the president in a crisis. This is the epitome of keeping our country isolated from foreign conflicts. All right, know the Neutrality Acts, connected to the Nye Committee Hearings, super important. Again, the Spanish Revolution was going on at that time. Hitler was sending some resources and materials to Spain to try and help prevent the overthrow of Spain by the communists that's there. High-speed planes, soldiers jumping out with planes with paratroops, high-speed tanks, lightning warfare. It's being perfected and tested out there. In 1936, also he marches back into the Rhineland, which was prohibited to him by the Treaty of Versailles to have any military forces there. Nobody does anything. verbal tongue lashing, no pow-pows of any serious nature whatsoever. Japan invades China in 1937. FDR makes a statement that we are super hateful of war in 1936, just prior to that, and with 1937's invasion of China, he makes a speech called the quarantine speech. Jump forward, it's a little out of place here, but basically he says that there is an epidemic of political disease, you might say, in the world community, and when there is a disease, the world community or the community has to join in together to quarantine the patients who are going to infect other people. We have to quarantine these radical fascist nations. Interesting cartoon here, and we got another Dr. Seuss cartoon, and according to the map here, as you can kind of see, Japan is expanding into China and other parts of the Pacific to gain raw materials and resources to grow its military. In 1938, Hitler starts pounding his fist about the Sudetenland. This was a territory that's kind of shaped like a horseshoe around the eastern, western, and southern edge of north and southern edge of Czechoslovakia, which was formed out of Germany. There are large numbers of Germans there. He starts saying the Germans are being mistreated, threatens an invasion unless that particular territory is given back to him. And Britain and France get together in this particular big meeting known as the Munich meetings and Munich conference. And they come up with a pact and an agreement and a promise from Hitler saying he'll demand no more as long as he's given this particular area. And this guy, Neville Chamberlain from Britain, says this guy Hitler, he's very negotiable, you can talk to him, he's easy to get along with, we have peace in our time, is what he said. And this particular event is the epitome of that term we talked about at the beginning called appeasement, right? Give the screaming baby what he wants, he'll be happy, right? No, he's just going to scream again, and he's going to wait for you to react and other countries to react to what his demands are. He gets more emboldened, he gets braver because of this giving in. And again, the Czechoslovakians were not in that meeting at all. In this Munich Pact, there was discussion, okay, well, what if we go to war? What if we defend Czechoslovakia? We don't give in to them. There's going to be a war. Well, it'll probably involve Russia, communist Russia. But if communist Russia isn't involved in the war, then they're potentially going to use their armies to spread communism, which would we least like to have. We would least like to have communism. So they appeased Hitler and the fascists, right? No more wars. Can't have it. Don't want communism to spread. That's what would happen in the war. Not too many months later, he just marches in and takes the rest of Czechoslovakia anyway. Czechoslovakia is gone. Again, part of that was Austro-Hungarian Empire and Germany from the Treaty of Versailles. In 1938, he demands that Austria be annexed, which is a German nation, into Germany as well. If you don't allow us to annex you peacefully, then we'll march in with military force, and they allow him to march in with his soldiers without any violence whatsoever, and Austria is annexed into Germany. The Germany of Empire is growing significantly bigger. And it's right about this point in time there are negotiations and discussions between Hitler and Stalin, two people that really despised each other and distrusted each other. Hitler hated communism, the concept of communism, and Stalin's paranoid of everybody as well. But they're both interested in Poland, and Poland was formed out of the Treaty of Versailles from German territory and from Russian territory, and it was a scenario where they basically come up with a non-aggression pact. It's not an alliance we love each other, even though it kind of looks like that in the cartoon. It's basically an alliance that's a non-aggression pact that says, you know, if I attack from the east, you can go ahead and attack from the west, and we will go ahead and divide Poland right somewhere in here. And that's what happens in 1939. In September 1st of 1939, Hitler invades Poland from the west, and Stalin invades from the east, and Poland is gobbled up by both. The war begins, and Britain and France declare war. At that point in time, World War II has begun. Not long after that, Japan sets up an alliance with Germany and Italy, and this is where we have the formation of the Axis alliance and Axis powers in World War II. And as that's happening, Japan is expanding more into the South Pacific for more raw materials and resources. Make sure you get your left side snap chart done. That's in the lesson 1. Make the hay, good day.